Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on the topic of Mind the Data Gap, why transport needs a gender dimension. Thank you so much for joining us for this, this discussion today. And we've got 4 amazing speakers lined up that are going to share their insights, and we also have some time for audience Q&A, and my colleague Olga will kick things off and talk a bit about women in mobility and what we do here in the UK.
Hi everyone, lovely to see you today with us. Thank you very much for joining. A couple of words about Women in Mobility UK. It's basically the network which has started in Germany, and in Germany, Austria and Switzerland, I think they have around 1,600 members at the moment. And we started small with the Women in UK Mobility, Women in Mobility London hub, and now we grew to Women in Mobility UK. And we see this network as a community for women and those who identify as female in the mobility sector to come together and discuss any topics or any concerns you may have. And it's more like a support network. We also organize events like today. And we established in 2020, just before the pandemic. And so far we just run online events, but we plan to have first face-to-face events next year. So join our LinkedIn page, and we welcome you to we're welcome to see you at more events.
Thank you, Olga. And just some very quick housekeeping. So we do want this session to be interactive. So if you've got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A section, which will allow us to manage it a bit easier. You're also welcome to introduce yourself in the chat. Please say hi, and yeah, any questions, just pop them in the Q&A. So we've got these 4 really amazing speakers. One of our speakers is Laura Brooks. Hi, Laura. Laura is a transport planner here in the UK, and she's co-created the Gender Equality Toolkit in Transport, also called Get It. And with that, she does some really, really great work on bringing the data debate to a more practical level. And we'll hear more about that later. We've got Kelly Saunders, who's dialed in from Australia. Hi, Kelly. Kelly is a mobility and gender expert with more than 10 years experience in the private and public sector in Europe and Australia. And Kelly is currently doing her PhD on new visions for gender work and care. And we look forward to hearing more from you very soon. And then we've got Dr. Leila Aitbiwali. Hi, Leila. Leila is the Assistant Professor in Transportation Research of the University of Southampton in the UK. And she's also done projects for the Imperial College in London and the World Bank, amongst other institutions. And she'll share a bit more on the aspect of security and safety and how that relates to this topic. And our 4th speaker is Hannah Bogda from the Department for Transport. Hi, Hannah, welcome to this session. And Hannah is part of the Gender Equality Network within the DFT, and she also heads up the Statistics Dissemination Team. And we'll start our session with Hannah, who is all over the data that we have and that we're collecting, and she'll tell us a bit more about what the DFT has found and what they're doing with this data. So Hannah, do you want to start your presentation?
Yes, I will just share my screen and then I can start. That is not a good start. There it is. Okay, is that on?
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, perfect. So good morning, everyone. As Sandra said, I work at the Department for Transport and I head up stats dissemination. So really all about stats, data and evidence here at the Department for Transport. Making transport work for everyone So in order to make sure that the transport system works for all genders, we need to ensure that policy is designed for everyone. In terms of policy design, we need to make sure that we have the representation and diversity of opinion and thought, and I'll cover what that means at DFT on the next slide. And we must also consider diverse characteristics in policy planning, which is all part of the conversation today as well. The next thing we need is data and evidence to understand how females use the transport system, which I'll cover a little bit in these slides, and obviously links back to the gender data gap. And we must also evaluate any policies that we put in place to ensure that changes do work for everyone. So in terms of gender representation at the Department for Transport, the latest DFT Gender Pay Gap report for 2020 shows that overall 46% of employees are female. It's not too bad. If you look at the chart here, the further left the bars are, the more senior the grade. And the most senior level that we have, the SCS, actually has the second highest female representation with 42%. But if you look in the middle at the bars, there's definitely more to be done there, particularly in terms of progression through the middle grades. And all areas of DFT do have action plans to address the pay gap that is caused by representation. It's also worth mentioning that our permanent secretary here at DFT is a female, Bernadette Kelly, and she very much champions gender inclusion across the department. Now turning to data and evidence and looking at what our official stats tell us about gendered travel, I'll be using the National Travel Survey, which is an annual household survey designed to monitor long-term trends in personal travel. I've got a little asterisk there next to 2020. Obviously, this was during the pandemic, so some travel behaviours may be different to previous years, and the sample size was substantially smaller. So I do make comparisons to previous years because of this. So looking at the stats, the first finding is that females in 2020 took more trips than males, but did not travel as far. So in 2020, females made 4% more trips than males. However, females travelled 22% less miles than males. So this partly reflects differences in the mode of travel used and also the types of trips, which I'll go on to on the next few slides, but this pattern can also be seen in 2019. So in terms of mode of travel, females made 22% more walking trips than males and slightly less car trips, around 1%. In terms of walking, the proportion of walking trips made by females, the greatest difference between females and males was in those aged 21 to 29, with 39% of females making walking trips compared to 27% for males. Not surprisingly, the age group that had the most walking trips for both genders is those aged 0 to 16, but you still see that difference there, where males had 38% having walking trips compared to 45% for females. And going to the car stats, the difference isn't massive when you look at it overall, slightly less at 1%, but the proportion of trips made by males as car drivers was greater than that of females for all age groups. And this may reflect differences in access to cars as well as different trip purposes. And then my final slide looks at the types of trips that females and males are making. So females made more shopping trips, which tend to be relatively short, whereas males made more commuting and business trips, which tend to be longer. So this goes back to the first slide, which finds that females travel less miles than males. In 2020, the difference overall is not massive. You have 18% of males going on shopping trips compared to 20% of females. But when you look at age groups in particular, for example, those aged 17 to 20, 16% of females made shopping trips compared to 8% of males. And for those aged 70 plus, again, you see a difference. So 38% of females made shopping trips compared to 33% of males. And then the final point here, during the pandemic, there was a lot of homeschooling, so education trips were lower than previous years. But if we look in 2019, females had a higher proportion of education trips compared to males. So these are kind of the overall differences that we find in the way males and females travel. And I will stop sharing now.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. That's really interesting, and that kind of correlates with what Caroline Criado Perez found in her book Invisible Women. And for anyone who hasn't read it yet, I highly recommend having a look at it. It's not an easy read, but it's a very important read. And she found, very early on in her book, she has a chapter on transport where she talks about the different travel behavior of women that results from women still doing more of the care work compared to men. She obviously looks at global data. Also, women often being poorer than men, hello gender pay gap, and also women doing more part-time work compared to men. So they have quite different travel behavior because their lives are very different. And it doesn't correspond anymore. The sort of point she makes is that we developed our transport systems according to the traditional model of the nuclear family, where the family, the husband and the wife with their 2 children live in the suburbs, and the wife stays at home, looks after the children, and the husband commutes to work and then back from work to the home. And the point she makes is that we really forget the needs of women and how their lives happen, and therefore how they travel and how that's very different. So that's kind of reflected in your data to a certain extent, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's useful to have these kind of large scale surveys to kind of confirm the smaller studies and show that these patterns are present at a wider distribution.
Yeah. And so do you think, is there any policy coming out of that, or what is the Department for Transport, what are they planning to do with this information?
That's a very good question. I think the first step that we've been making is getting this data and evidence and getting it to a good place. I think we always try and make sure that we have our own stats and research to find what these differences are. And then I think the next step probably is thinking about how we can improve policies. Actually, the ITF, the International Travel Forum, are developing similar to maybe what other people are talking about today, but a gender analysis toolkit actually for departments, transport departments across the world, really, to actually help them develop policies that are more aligned to gender.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So that was one of the questions we had. We've got another question from Maria here who's asking, what's the gender distribution when it comes to operational roles? Do you have any information on that?
I'm going to try and look that up. So I think come back to me, because there is a breakdown in the report of there's different areas of DFT and there's a more operational side. So I'm just going to see if there is a difference there, and I'll come back to you on that. Okay, brilliant. So we'll get back to you on that, Maria. Thank you so much, Hannah. Let's move on to our next speaker, and we've got more time for questions further down the line. So we've got Layla here, and Layla is looking at the safety and security angle of transport, and you've also published 2 papers on this topic. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandra. So I'll be sharing my screen. Yeah, so let me know if you can't see anything, but I assume everything is fine.
Yeah.
All right, so well, thanks. I'm really happy to be doing this talk today because yeah, this is work that I've done, it's academic work, and I think it's really crucial to try and share, given the nature and the sensitivity of the topic and fact that it is one of the big challenges of transport in the coming decades. I do think it's always a great thing to try and share this with people who are practitioners, to both provide them with the information about what are the differences in patterns and travel decisions between men and women, but also to try and understand what are the determinants of these travel patterns. And so I'll be talking about safety, security, but essentially the differences in perceptions. So I guess this is, the next step after what Hannah's been talking about. Men and women have got different travel patterns, but why? That's more focusing on the why, that's the case. So yeah, of course, the DFT the World Bank, a lot of institutions document the fact that there are different travel patterns between men and women, both in higher income and lower income countries, and they are different natures. So the thing is, when it comes to analyzing this, usually, if we just refer to the standard models from an academic point of view, we just say that people have got different travel patterns, and that's essentially due to differences in personal preferences. So it's just a matter of taste, assuming that, well, it's all down to choice. But of course, what the main limitations of this type of framework is that it does not necessarily acknowledge the existence of barriers. And I'm sure that as practitioners, you're well aware that there's a wide range of barriers to mobility, such as the lack of accessibility, the fact that women cannot necessarily afford the same transport modes as men, because, for instance, they've got a more limited access to cars and stuff like that. So there's also the quality of the service can affect their perceptions, and can, especially given that women experience harassment in public transport, for instance, which can then affect their propensity to use more or less a certain type of public transport. So these barriers are numerous, and they all each of them constitute a challenge that only waits to be tackled by practitioners and transport operators. So what's key here is that the effects of these barriers are ambiguous, because, okay, we can see at first, if we look at, for instance, DFT data, women travel more than men, or travel more often than men, or less often than men. And also in my work, I found that in developing economies, for instance, women rely more on public transport, but we could see, if we just base ourselves on the taste story, it would mean that they just like public transport, but it's actually more complex than that, because they can be captive, because they've got less outside options. But at the same time, women could also be using public transport less because it's less accessible. So the idea is that it's really important to try and disentangle what are the determinants of these travel patterns. And so analyzing individual perceptions kind of gives us information on what is the backstory, what is the motivation, the reason why people behave in a certain way. So yeah, in one of my projects, we basically used a huge amount of data on about 40 cities worldwide, which covers all continents but Africa. And so on a big number of years as well, so 10 years and counting, because we constantly have got this new data. And so we used customer satisfaction surveys for buses and metros in a big number of cities, and found that there is a gender gap in the perception of safety and security. So what I mean here by security is personal security, as in the fear of being harassed or the fear of being attacked or any sort of personal threat. And so we found that women are 10% more likely than men to feel less secure in metros, and 6% more likely than men to feel less secure in buses. And that's something that's significant, that has been observed for over hundreds of thousands of observations. So that is something that is very strong. And that's something that we see worldwide as well. And that's what I really would like to emphasize. But there is also a gender gap in terms of overall satisfaction, which then shows that there is also an incentive for transport providers to try and tackle that. But a lot of them don't necessarily gather this information in the first place. So it really shows that there is a gap here that only waits to be analyzed, and a challenge that needs to be sorted. So, and also another thing is that there are big differences in the perceptions of infrastructure. For instance, an example is that women's satisfaction levels significantly increase when there is more staff in stations and also in trains. So it shows that it makes them feel more secure. So now that I've mentioned these findings, the idea is, how do we turn these facts into actions? So the key element would be to collect sex disaggregated satisfaction survey data regularly at a high frequency, because frequency is key to try and follow up and measure performance and improve the quality, the transport experience of women. And also, I would like to emphasize the fact that, of course, quantification is always more convincing, because what gets measured can get done. And without these numbers, well, it's only one part of the convincing that can be done. That's really the conclusion I came to with this work. And what's also important to mention is that, well, it's not just the infrastructure or the or individuals' tastes that affect people's satisfaction levels, because, for instance, looking at people's responses to the Me Too scandal, we found that in another paper that we published, that women are more likely to not feel secure in public transport past the Me Too scandal, all other things being equal. So the idea is that there was not more aggressions, there was nothing, the situation really hasn't changed, and if not, it was controlled for in the model. But it shows that when these topics are being discussed, women's norm changes, and now they're more likely to have a voice and voice their concerns. So that's the double effect for transport providers, because when they collect this information and also they put this issue, they make it a real debate and a problem that needs to be tackled. There is also less of this underreporting, and women are more likely to just speak up and say that this is an issue. And, well, you know, in the whole process of trying to tackle this problem, I guess this, I guess this means that it's even more crucial to gather information on this topic to try and, create a proper target in terms of satisfaction levels that can then be followed up in the years after, to try and make women's travel experience more positive and to improve just their mobility. So that's it for my little presentation. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thanks, Leila. That's really interesting, isn't it? And I mean, the whole sort of security and personal safety debate is a really important one, because it affects our lives on a very very important level, and we've seen in previous studies how women change their behavior to accommodate for this fear they have on transport. So there was a study in New York a few years ago that found that it leads to a higher expense for women, because they change their behavior and use more expensive modes of transport like taxis, because they just don't feel safe. So it also costs them more money, and it doesn't allow women to use transport systems the way we should, really, without concern for our own safety. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. As it's also an interesting point that the Me Too movement has led women to be more outspoken about this. I think that's a really, really good result, because now we know, well, this is not normal. It shouldn't be normal. We shouldn't accept it, and we should be loud about it and speak about it, so something can be done. Have you seen any specific change coming out of this, or are we still in the sort of awareness, education, data gathering stage, do you think?
Well, again, these are topics that are, well, you know, this data is actually being collected to try and for benchmarking purposes. So it's really about costs and revenue and so on. So that's at the moment what convinces transport operators to collect this type of data. But I guess that's why I think like collaborations between operators and academia is important, because we've got the freedom to then, you know, answer focus on questions that they won't necessarily focus on. But we've presented actually these results to them, and they were really interested. And well, you know, for the Me Too results, I was telling them that, you know, you could see this, you could see then the Me Too scandal as a negative. You could see a drop in satisfaction and think, oh, that's bad, but we did the same, we provided the same thing. But the idea is that it is just that these signals were well, it's just signaling that there is an issue and there is this underreporting. And I guess if we collect more information, there would be less underreporting, and then we will really see the extent of the issue to then try and provide the best solution and not just kind of put it under the carpet of lack of knowledge. And so yeah, I guess it's still at early stage, but hopefully will change.
Yeah, thanks. We've got some audience questions here. John is asking, there is another dimension, at least, religious and cultural diversity, the most obvious, but life stage like parent, carer, etc. is also important. Generally, as the 1980s and 90s battle for disability shows, improvements for one group are improvements for the majority of the community. And what's the panel's view on this one? So is there anyone who would like to comment on this?
Oh, I can just make a quick comment because, again, I've worked on data that covers a lot of different countries. And with the models, we control for the country fixed effects. So the effect that we see is that even if we control for everything, there is still this gender gap. So this 10% difference is no matter what, whether you consider New York or Istanbul, this is what you find on average. So it really shows that there is this gap, regardless of the structural differences between countries, which I think is a really interesting thing to note, to just say this is not a country level thing.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to comment on John's question?
I was going to come in. I think it's a really good point, because obviously women fit into more than one category. We're not just women, we might be disabled, we might be from a different race. So all of those things you need to keep in mind as well. And I think that's the point of designing a transport system for everyone. One of the interesting stats that I didn't pick out from the survey that I was talking about was that females actually tend to report more mobility difficulties as well than males, particularly those aged 70 plus. So that's kind of another dimension that if we had a better understanding of the way females travel, is something that you would consider. And obviously, if you're making something better for females with mobility difficulties, you're also making it better for everyone with mobility difficulties. So there are obviously, improvements across more than one group of people.
Yeah, exactly. And also because women quite often travel with small children, with the elderly, or with the grocery bags, and are just more sort of encumbered with having to use transport in that way, having barrier-free transport would be hugely beneficial as well, wouldn't it? Okay, thank you. We've got one more question that we come back to later, but maybe let's move on to Kelly. You're going to talk about gender mainstreaming in transport, amongst other things. So please.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Sandra. Hello, everybody. My name's Kelly Saunders, and you were very kind to say I've had 10 years of experience in work. I've had 20, but 10 years in working in an operator. So I was working as a lawyer doing public tenders across the world. So from Europe and Australia, but now I'm in Australia. And I wanted to start, I think, by a slightly different approach. It's a bit of a 1970s consciousness raising approach, which is quite different to the data, but I'll get there. So really sort of thinking about collective efforts on this subject, actually. I feel that actually we've had statistics on women's different travel patterns since the 1980s. If you go back to, sort of the transportation reports that were being produced in the States, like international reports everywhere since the 80s, we've known women move very differently than men, and it's always the same security and mobility of care issues, really at the very heart of things. And so we sort of see a real banalisation of this. I think that people have just become so used to this being the case that it's sort of normal to not really meet women's needs. Actually, it's just the system. And so I think there's a change. There's a change in the understanding, I think, and an interest that's growing amongst transport operators and different players. But there's still a lot of inertia, and that really comes in the implementation. So we're still in this consciousness raising phase and searching for good practice. access. I don't know, I'll get to that in a minute. So I think part of the problem is it's hard to imagine anything else. That's part of the issue here. So we're getting data about the way we move, and this is all great, but what are we actually going towards? Is something different. And that's sort of what I do in my PhD, which is about futures. It's about, feminist futures, actually. But in my consulting work as a mobility consultant, I kind of help people to imagine what that future transport system looks like, what it feels like, what it actually, what it smells like. And it's sort of designing for joy in a way, designing for sort of extremely human embodied things that get forgotten our reflections on transport. So for an example, rather than your kid falling into a dirty adult toilet, if there is a toilet in the transport system, they have their own small toilet for a small body. And that they're designed for. And I can't tell you the difference when you're designed for, and I feel like this is a huge underestimation in the way we design transport networks, that we're not realizing the intergenerational potential of designing for children, for example. So I sort of work on the design and build side, but also operations, contract, the entire network to kind of, infuse gender into all of that, which is the mainstreaming that you're talking about, Sandra. I just want to come back to data briefly, which was to talk about, I think, one of the most unmeasured aspects of women's mobility is just the fact that most women who are worried about their safety or have complex mobility, whenever they can, they don't leave the house. They actually don't leave the house. And if they have an unsafe incident in public transport, 1 in 100 women stop leaving the house, which is absolutely enormous. And that's research across a number of global cities. I think that Safe in the City report was the source of that, but it's huge. And so this has massive unmeasured impact on our democratic and citizenship rights, our social life, our ability to have dignified work. And I think we should actually be quite angry about that. And I think most people are, but I suppose one of my key points is to bring that anger into our work, actually, because that is kind of outrageous. And it's something that is considered to be a wicked problem. But I know that having worked in the pointy end of contracts, in public transport contracts, that we haven't tried, actually, really. We have not tried in those contracts to solve some of these issues. So gender neutrality, which is, the system, and I get that a lot, the system is gender neutral. And I think, the more further I go in this, the more I see, it is a complete fiction. That's the reality, because, very little in life is actually gender neutral, but transport systems are incredibly gendered, really. Like, if we start from the point that the majority of violence and the majority of sexual violence committed in public transport is by men. And nobody actually ever says this because it's uncomfortable. It's actually one of those uncomfortable truths. And that's violence committed against men and women. But the perpetrator, who we never talk about, is usually male. Like, it's something like 98%, and that is consistent across most crime statistics. So if anybody's got any alternative stats, I'd be very keen to hear them. And I know the issue of not all men, we talk about not all men, and I would urge people to look into the work of Michael Flood, who is a Queensland University professor. He is doing brilliant work on this conversation around implicating men and boys into sort of policy and sort of the conversation around gender equality. He's absolutely brilliant. He's just done some great work for the UN. He's an international star, I think. So Michael Flood, look him up, because the masculinity of transport systems is pretty obvious. And these systems are not designed for the female body or female experiences. So when people say, why gender? Why do we work on gender equality in transport? For me, it sort of seems quite absurd, because the system is so obviously gendered that we're really just trying to balance here. That's the real point. So gender mainstreaming, essentially for me, it's the process of asking, does every single decision that we're making in the transport network, wherever you are in the ecosystem, does it work for men and women? And does it work also for gender diverse people? And increasingly that is coming into the conversation. So that's great news, because that's really huge progress, very recent progress. So it applies to everything. It applies to modal shift measures. It applies to performance measures, infrastructure. It's really, that question, can be asked of everything. And so how do we know if it applies to men and women differently and gender diverse people? That is through the data that Hannah and Layla were talking about. But I will also say it's through new data. We need to integrate non-transport data into this conversation and integrate, so we get, and I think Layla, you're nodding, it's really, that is such a key part, is like health data and what is the bigger story here. And the fact is women are like all over the world have this incredible spatial entrapment, and that we don't talk about that very much, but that is sort of the reality. And so what do we do about that? That's kind of a real conversation. So co-creation, I think, is something we might touch on a little bit later, but is obviously a really valuable tool, and I'm sure Laura will talk about that as well. But ethnography as well, I've done some research for Transport Infrastructure Ireland. We used with Arup ethnography, which was a very powerful way to cut through and to kind of have authentic voices, just telling very humble stories, and that had huge impact at the policy level. And actually, it's really rippling through the whole organisation, that piece of work. So yes, so some lessons that I've learned from mainstreaming before I finish up over several projects now. Resistance, I guess I just wanted to talk about that. A lot of people say there's no issue, or they'll struggle to see the issue. And there's some really great resources on resistance to gender equality. There's the EU have done dealing with resistance, easy to Google that. But then Victorian government in Australia, actually the health department, randomly, but it's one of the best reports I've seen on this issue of gender equality resistance. It's called Encountering Resistance in Gender Equality. It's so simple, it's so excellent. So look it up. Too hard, too many barriers around data collection. I've heard people say it's a privacy issue, even though we're talking about disaggregating by male and female. So, people sort of misunderstand privacy, in the confusion, I suppose. But I suppose I'm telling you these things in order to, like, when we want to put these gender equality projects into the system and get these projects up, we've got to anticipate these and be ready to kind of, deal with them at each level of the governance process. Not in our scope, which comes up a lot with public space. And so this is, I don't think we've got time for this argument anymore. Like, we have to partner. We have to partner broadly, and, this idea that you have this narrow siloed scope just doesn't work anymore. So, and I think people are starting to realise this now with decarbonisation. So it is changing. The governance process, it's so easy for a gender project to become a nice to have rather than a must have. So you have to have the fiercest and most tenacious support through the governance process. I think that's certainly been true that I've seen. Otherwise, it's just not gonna, it'll be just words, nice words. So why collect data that is negative? And I think, Layla, you beautifully talked about, some of that like sort of, it's too big a complex conversation for me to have right this minute, but that is obviously a worry for people. Why collect data that is going to draw negative attention to our organisation? And it's really the start of a massive maturation that we have to go through on this topic. If I had it all the hours out in the day, I'd do this, and for me that the response to that is, this is not adding to the work, it's actually changing the work, so it's changing the way we do transport, and that shouldn't, hopefully, once you've adjusted, add more work. Universal design is often used as kind of the response to everything, and a lot of people don't even know what it is, I think, but I think it's great and it's absolutely necessary for accessibility in stations and trains, but it's just the beginning, I think, for true gender equality throughout the entire system. And my final point is just around evaluation, because one of the issues I have is often I'm asked for best practice around the world, and I just we're at this consciousness raising point still, and we really need to move to implemented projects that are properly evaluated, and so they are we can talk about them as having impact, and that's something that is done so well in other areas of the transport process. Like if you're talking about accident safety, is the most brilliantly industrialized process pretty much everywhere, and we need to harness that kind of diligence and that kind of resourcing, in order to do this well, because the root cause analysis that is possible of is huge, but it's just not resourced. So that's all I've got for you. I just
A lot of great points there, Kelly, and we've got quite a few questions from the audience, but we'll come back to those questions. But let's move on to Laura first, and the gender equality toolkit that you've co-created. Tell us more about that, please.
So hopefully that should be all on your screen now.
Yeah.
Just loading something. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly talk about the Gender Equality Toolkit in Transport, which I co-created alongside Molly Hoggard and Marie Godwood as part of funding from the Future Transport Visions Group. So hopefully today's talk will encourage you to use the toolkit and begin to see how it can be used to help aid the gender gap, alongside further highlighting how the transport operators and systems in which they work must adapt to the needs of women, as opposed to making women adapt to them. So this is the toolkit. So it's an online web open access resource, which has three main aims: to inform, to support, and to mobilize and unite. So if you go on www.thegetit.com, you'll be able to see all this and you can run through it. So as shown on this handy graphic that we've created, the toolkit has 8 areas of focus, which were informed by a 3-pronged research approach, which included industry-wide surveys, a literature review, and focus groups. So notable for today, disaggregated data is one of the 8 areas, alongside education and awareness, empowering industry, inclusive design, monitoring and evaluation, create change, progressive policy, and engagement and consultation. So each of these 8 areas highlight a different point to help you consider what changes could be made in your work. So the aim of the toolkit is to help challenge assumptions and any unconscious bias that you may have. So not all points may be feasible for whichever area of work that you work in. And however, the point is that if you look at the ones that do relate to what you do, they'll have be able to help in some way, shape, or form. And in some cases, you'll be able to look at more than one. Although they're on their own, they should be considered together. So for each of the 8 areas of focus, we have listed on their respective page drivers for change, which are things that you can do to help sort of take action. We've got case studies of where they've worked before, and resources, podcasts, and videos, so different things that you can read, look at in your own time to be able to learn a bit more about it or see what you can do about it. So on this slide, I've specifically focused on the data. So it shows how the areas of focus and drivers of change can be used to better consider data when planning and designing a transport project or policy. As already highlighted by today's presenters, women are historically and frequently underrepresented in data used in design, engineering, transport, and research in general, despite women making up roughly 50% of the population. The data used is therefore heavily biased towards males and therefore likely to misrepresent the needs of women and fail to capture insights and opportunities for females. Therefore, in order to change this, I've picked out key drivers for change from some of our areas of focus. So on our education and awareness page, we talk about how challenging the status quo and business as usual to address gender inequality. We need to therefore transition away from business as usual. So collecting gender disaggregated data becomes the norm as opposed to a rarity. So on the engagement page, so engagement is a fundamental component when designing transport policy or projects to make sure it meets the needs of all users. Therefore, engaging with data with gender experts will help to ensure that gender disaggregated data is incorporated within the consultation activities, and therefore help to ensure data collected is representative of the target population. So our inclusive design page outlines how designs need to better represent the people who use it. Therefore, using participatory design processes which seek the views of different groups of people, including women, will ensure that gender considerations are incorporated within the design process. The data is utilised in practically all transport projects and can be incredibly powerful to better understand and respond to the issues of safety. By including attitude perception surveys, data can be valuable in identifying areas of concern and understanding how schemes are perceived, which can be different to how they are intended. So once a scheme is in place, or a plan or a policy, it is key to monitor and evaluate the scheme to assess if the travel patterns have changed or if the issues identified beforehand have improved. So by collecting post-implementation data, it will help to generate lessons learned and best practice, which will allow for success stories and what didn't work to be shared so others can learn from it. And obviously things can be changed. So then on this slide here, I've listed some useful resources and case studies which we recommend using, which are shown on the Getter. So there's the Changing Lanes study, which was conducted by the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, which was commissioned to help advance efforts to achieve a more gender equitable transport system. The study sought to bridge the data gap by collecting information on the unique experiences and needs of women navigating Los Angeles transportation system. So there's the Your Ground Victoria Australia report, and this was a project which surveyed women and gender diverse people to understand their experiences and perceptions of safety when using open spaces for leisure, sport, exercise or play within Victoria. So the study used the Your Ground crowdsourced mapping tool, which allowed participants to anonymously geotag their experiences of safety to a specific open place. So there's Tramline Toolkit for gender sensitive data, which Kelly briefly touched on, and that's one of 4 toolkits which they created. And then there's the Sustrand Bike Life study, which was the largest assessment of cycling in 18 urban areas across the UK and Ireland. So city data and a representation of questionnaires of all residents was used to measure behaviours, attitudes, infrastructure and the benefits of cycling. And the data was reviewed in relation to the groups that participated less in cycling, including women. Then there's the Transport for London's Travel in London, Understanding Our Diverse Communities research report, which sets out the results from different areas of research regarding the barriers faced by London's communities when accessing transport, and gender was one of 7 equality groups which were focused on within the report. And then there's also the City of Sydney's On the Go, How Women Travel Around the City report, which presents data regarding different drivers for mode choice and enabling factors and challenges which women in the city face when walking and cycling. So as mentioned, the links to each of these resources are on the Get It page.
Okay.
And that's so that was a quick whistle tour through the Get It and the area of focus of data. So if you've got any more information, obviously visit the website or look at our LinkedIn page.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Laura. That was really interesting. We've got a lot more questions from the audience, and here's one question that maybe Kelly, you're a good person to answer that. Lucy's asking, reporting is only one aspect. Often women don't want to report and get involved in the sometimes flawed and inefficient justice system. Alternatives to capture this information without creating a new problem are also key. What's your view on that? How can we make sure that we don't just put the onus on women to report everything?
Yeah, well, I think that's where the issue comes about, actually having the uncomfortable conversations to talk to men about men as well. You know, this is really that, and there are lots of ways that I kind of think about doing that. I mean, just to answer the question, I mean, I think some of that Your Ground work is really getting to women's experiences where they can actually map those things anonymously. So if they don't want to go through the process of making that report, they can at least, you know, participate to show that, you know, there's some activity going on. But I mean, ultimately we want to create an environment where people can report, women can report, and they feel like they're going to be, you know, taken seriously. They're going to be dealing with people who are gender sensitive trained, and, you know, I mean, this utopian world where this actually works, you know, and that the magistrate is going to actually understand the nature of the complaint. But we've got a long way to go. That is absolutely the reality. But I think a lot about this new issue that I've seen, and the resistance to gender equality materials talk about this, which is this idea of like flipping the script, which I think is really good. And I've started doing it, and it's actually really hard. So instead of saying, you know, passively women face disadvantage, you know, because of X, Y, Z, it's like actually men enjoy advantage, or men benefit from, you know, like actually flipping the script. And it's sort of, it's a strange process to get used to. And I've been doing it in my report writing more and more, but I think it's one way for us to actually really put the focus where it should be, you know, which is on actually the benefits and also the real issues, you know, which is largely male perpetrator driven violence and sexual harassment. So yeah, not an easy one. But also I think, I mean, I've been reading a lot about this for my PhD, but the process of having those uncomfortable conversations in the department or in your organisation, you know, it doesn't have to be aggressive or conflictual. I mean, you know, that discomfort can be done, you know, with care, with ethics, you know, and with great respect, you know. But I suppose learned from my lessons as a young transport professional, where I just didn't want to rock the boat for many years. You know, I didn't have that. I was quite shy, and I really separated my feminism from my job, you know. And I think that's the first key thing to do, is that we have to mix them. You know, we have to bring them into the same place, and have the confidence to do that by finding other people. It's the collective collective power that I was talking about. There you go.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I also liked how you talked about bringing your anger to work. And I can see that from a different perspective, because I live with reduced mobility myself. So I experience transport as a disabled person every day. And I think the disabled community is doing a really good job of being angry. We're really angry when we can't use transport because it's just not built for us in many ways, and we just haven't been considered, and we've sort of been forgotten. And I think we're now seen as we're allowed to be angry, but as a female, you still have that sort of, I don't know, I don't want to be too uncomfortable, right? I don't want to be seen as too loud or too angry or too this or too that. So I think that's a really good point. Bringing that anger into work and translating that into something productive. I think that's really powerful. So we've got another question here from John, who's saying, great points, Kelly. Whilst access and signage improvements on vehicles, and to a lesser extent stations and stops, have been widely implemented, design taking account of gender and age has hardly figured. Any agenda point for governments at all levels from local up? So I guess that is about the design.
It might be a good moment to mention the TramLab work, actually, because I think that's very government focused, and let somebody else take the floor. But I was going to mention a little bit, we sort of organised that with Sandra to talk about that TramLab project that Laura referred to as well. It was actually a huge co-creation exercise in November 2019, and I was in Melbourne at the time, and I took part because I actually collaborate with one of the organisations, XYX Lab, from time to time, and so it was just pre-pandemic. It was absolutely lucky that they got it in, because it was about 120, even more people in a room co-creating, very, very targeted, extremely well done. A partnership between the Victorian government and 3 major universities in Victoria. So very, very well resourced, really just such a next level kind of event. And they were really focused on co-creation around women-led reporting tools. So actually creating the tools that women would want to use, coming back to that earlier question, asking priorities, women's, or not just women, but diverse range of stakeholders, government, there were operators, and it was a very diverse group, about priorities for further research, creating a safety checklist that would be provided to all levels of government in Victoria. So that was their very clear objective as well. And seeking feedback on advertising and safety campaigns. It was really interesting. We did some exercises where we kind of crowded in a whole lot of advertising in a bus stop and talked about how we felt about that. And it was just, what was the sum total of quite ominous advertising or quite sexualized advertising, and how did you feel about that? So there were all these sort of quite clear exercises we had to go through, and what is the role for technology? And so then they've come up with these 4 toolkits around communications campaigns, placemaking, data, which is what Laura referred to, and training. And so I think it's really a good place to start when you're talking about where governments are wanting to head.
So maybe, would you mind posting the link to that in the chat? And also if you have the link to the Michael Flood reference that you made. And Laura, if you could put in the chat the link to your Get It website, that would be amazing as well, so people can just copy that out. So we're almost out of time. We've got another great question from Maria, who actually leads to how we want to end this session. Maria's asking, what can us women in the transport sector with less decision power do to help improve it? And I want to widen that question to, what can anyone in the transport sector do to help improve the situation? And are there any concrete steps we can take? So Hannah, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's obviously the obvious things that we've talked about today in terms of policy design and things like that. But going back to Maria's question of, if you don't have that power or decision-making process, I think there's still lots of things you can do. I'm part of the Gender Equality Network at the Department of Transport. You can set up your own network where you start to champion all of the ideas that we've talked about today. You can try and find a senior sponsor within your organisation who supports you and can champion you at that level. And also it's all about influence and promoting, so you can get talks in. I set up exactly the same thing as we've got today, a panel session at the department to get people having those conversations, so that people start thinking about what they can do personally. So you can definitely have influence from the bottom up as well.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. And Layla, what are your thoughts?
Well, again, I guess that's one of the difficult things, because I have taken the problem more the other way around, thinking that, informing the people who are decision makers is the way that usually, you kind of do recommendations from a research viewpoint. But that's why I think it's very interesting that it makes me think that, in day-to-day life, given that there is this gender gap, actually, we should probably provide solutions for people who are practitioners, but that's not necessarily at the highest decision level. So I guess this is a bit of a puzzle, to be honest. It's just highlighting the limitations of the way we design recommendations, because I guess we're just saying, again, what will come to mind is really to encourage people to champion, to encourage, and to participate when there is like debates like this, to really take part and to show up, at least, because this is just showing support. So when something is being debated and being supported, I guess that's like just triggering the debate. But it makes me think also that when we provide recommendations, it would be good also to try and include people who can do it on a daily basis, really.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Thank you. And Laura, what are your thoughts?
I would say from what we learned from doing our research, I think it was just have the conversations, just get people talking about it at any level, and I think just see where it leads to. Obviously looking at the toolkit, I should plug that. That's quite useful. But yeah, I think just have the conversations with everyone and anyone, and keep talking about it. And share, if you see something useful, share it with people, and just see what you can do. Because at the end of the day, if you don't talk about it, nothing's going to change. I think if you keep talking about it and then see what changeable actions you can do at different levels, it's all going to help.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. Kelly, what are your thoughts?
I'd probably say looking at the ways that you can influence your own job. So, the penny dropped for me sort of halfway through, towards the end actually of my time as a lawyer, where I was looking at these contracts constantly and just didn't even think about it from a gender perspective. And then it suddenly occurred to me that I could actually be suggesting things in these tenders which might help, So I think in lots of jobs, like there are actually ways that you can incorporate this into your existing work, already. That would be mine.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Keep talking about it, but also I think we need to keep asking questions, because quite often when we look at our own work, it might not be quite clear where are the gender aspects in this. Like SkedGo, for example, we do mobility as a service technology, and we're not quite sure what that means for us and where that fits in. We're quite clear on accessibility, and we know how to tackle that from all sorts of different angles for people with different disabilities, physical, vision impairment. We can look at that, but gender, we're not quite sure. How do we deal with safety, security? We're still sort of working our way through that, but I think also not being afraid of asking those uncomfortable questions and putting them out there in work meetings and discussing them. That's really important too, even when you're not quite sure what the solution is.
One thing I just would add just on that as well is something that's really helped me is, and it's really a bit left field, but read like classic feminist literature, because it actually, even though it doesn't directly apply to your work, it's an enormously creative process, because it triggers all of these ideas. And I'm not talking about lean in, I'm talking about Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, if you can finish it in your lifetime, or but I think it's really gives you depth, and it's very nourishing in terms of your work and how you think about gender at your work.
Yeah, and definitely read this one. Highly recommend it. It's 2 years old now, but it's very up to date. So we've come to the end of our session. Thank you so much. I mean, we could go on and on about this topic. It's so interesting. Thank you all for sharing your expertise and your knowledge and your wisdom on this. And thank you to the lovely audience for asking your questions. And I'll hand over to Sarah from Cities Today, who kindly hosted us today.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks to Sandra and all the panelists and the audience. My name's Sarah and I'm a journalist and editor at Cities Today, which is a global publication for city innovation and mobility leaders. So we were pleased to host this important topic today, and we've talked a lot about insights to action. So, we want to be a platform to share the work that you're actually doing, that continue the discussion, tell us what's worked, what's not worked, so that cities and transport organisations can learn from each other and actually make change in this area. So thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, you can reach me on LinkedIn or email me via Cities Today. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll close out here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.